Okay, why don't we get started? As I said, my name is Stefan Haggard. I direct the Korea Pacific program here. And I'm really pleased to have another session of this webinar, which has been keeping Munsub and me sane during the COVID lockdown. We want to start by thanking the very generous support we've received from the Korea Foundation for this series and give you some sense of some of the things we have coming up in the next several weeks. So next week, there's going to be a session on what we know about the North Korean economy. Byung-Young Kim from SNU, who has written, to me, the best book on the North Korean economy, will be joining us from Korea. Bill Brown is an analyst who spent many years in the intelligence community in the United States and is now at the Korea Economic Institute. And then I've been writing on this for some time, as some of you know, and will be reporting on some new findings with respect to what's going on with North Korean trade. So that's next week. The week after, we have a very interesting panel planned on purges in communist systems. And Zui Trin, who's currently at Princeton, he's a former GPS student, is going to talk about Vietnam. Edward Goldring is going to talk about North Korea. And we're going to be joined by Victor Xu, who will also talk about some of what he knows about purges in China. So this will be a chance to look at the North Korean political system in comparative perspective and think in particular about this mechanism of the purge and how purges are used to maintain power in that system. I'm particularly pleased to announce two new additions to the schedule, which we've managed to secure over the course of the last week. Melissa Hannum, in my view, is probably the top analyst in the country, if not the world. She's currently in Vienna on the use of satellite imagery to study North Korea, and particularly its weapons programs. She spent many years at the Institute in Monterey. You know some of the work up there that they've done on this. She's now at the One Earth Future, where she basically heads up their program on satellite analysis. And she'll be talking not only about the North Korean case, but for students here in particular about how to use this sort of data for analytic purposes. As you know, there's been this dramatic growth in the open source intelligence community, and Melissa's really a leader in that field. And so for those of you interested in using your data skills in a novel way, I think that session will be particularly interesting. And then finally, I'm pleased to add to the roster Sandra Fahey, who some of you may have heard of. She wrote a very good book interviewing North Korean refugees at some length, talking about their experiences with the famine in particular. And she's now written a new book on human rights in North Korea, and particularly the effort of the international community to affect human rights in North Korea, including the Commission of Inquiry. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation. In addition, she's an anthropologist, which brings a different methodological approach to these questions, and she's a really fine one. And so I look forward to that. She's currently at Sophia University. Today, I'm particularly pleased to welcome back to GPS Jong-sung You, who is a former colleague here before he went back to the other side of the Pacific. He spent time at ANU, and he's now at Gachon, where he heads this new Korea Inequality Research Lab. He's going to be reporting on some of the findings there. And given the fact we've spent a lot of time on security issues and North Korea and so forth, it's good to get back to South Korean questions and this very important issue of increasing inequality in South Korea, which historically has been one of the most equal countries in the world, or at least by old data standards. Jong-sung will be talking a little bit about that today. I just want to mention a couple of his publications, though. For those of you who are familiar with Google Scholar, he has a very famous piece on corruption, which has been cited about 1,000 times last time I looked. And he has what I think is a quite important book called Democracy, Inequality, and Corruption, which is a comparative analysis of the relationship between corruption and economic growth, among other outcomes, in Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines. It's really a wonderful piece of comparative work, and I always recommend it highly to students. Jong-sung, I think we agreed that you would talk for maybe 20, 25 minutes, and then Munsub and I can ask you some questions. If that works for you, why don't you take the floor?
Okay. Thank you for having me. It's great to be with the GPS community via this webinar. So I am leading Korea Inequality Research Lab at Cotton University, and let me share some of our research. Are you seeing my slides?
No, not yet.
Not yet.
Curtis, could you make the Jong-sung co-host?
Yeah,
just in
yeah.
case?
There it is.
Yeah. Okay. So first, let me talk briefly about Korea was known to have achieved growth with equity, but now Korea has slowed down in growth, and inequality has been increasing, and there is a debate about when did it start? When did the inequality start to grow, and why? And secondly, about measuring inequality. So measuring inequality is always a difficult problem. And traditionally, survey data has been used. And we are now using administered data in addition to survey data. And there is an attempt to estimate the distributional national accounts. In the last year, I will briefly mention about the current debate on social policy in Korea surrounding the introduction of universal basic income or universal employment insurance, both of which no country has ever implemented. So this shows Korea's levels of inequality in land and income around 1960. So you see Korea has one of the lowest levels of inequality in both land ownership and income. And that was a good starting background for Korea's industrialization and growth. And Korea maintained low inequality during the period of rapid industrialization and high growth. So Gini coefficient, you see, yeah, 33, around the 33 from 1970 to 88. So it was possible because of almost full employment with the job growth in export-oriented manufacturing sector, and the wage inequality was contained low. But Koreans in Korea, the growing inequality became increasingly salient issue, especially after the financial crisis and subsequent reform. So the prevailing view still, or misconception, was Korea's inequality became worsened due to the neoliberal reforms post the financial crisis. The labor market flexibility brought about labor market dualism, and which widened the inequality. That's a conception. But if we look at this figure, Statistics Korea's announced income Gini's, you see the low during the 1980s, inequality has actually declined slightly, and since 1992, inequality has been growing. The 1997-8, there was a jump, but you see general trend. So it was accelerated after the financial crisis, but the inequality already began to rise in the early 1990s with globalization and liberalization and the deindustrialization already started, and the demographic changes, changes in family structure and aging population. So these brought about labor market dualism, and inequality began to grow.
Jong-sung, can I just make one clarifying point for those of you who don't look at this kind of data, is just explaining the difference between the market income and disposable income, which is after taxes and transfers, correct?
Yeah, thank you. So the blue line represents market income inequality before taxes and transfer, and the red line, the disposable income inequality after taxes and transfer. But you see, there are two lines starting from 2006. So previously, Korea's Statistics Korea, household survey was restricted to 2-person or more households in urban areas only. So excluding rural households and single-person urban households. And when all households were surveyed, both market income inequality and disposable income inequality rose. So one thing, one of the issues was that by international standards, this level of inequality, especially market income inequality, is very low, and the disposable inequality was not very high, lower than OECD average, and that was different from people's perceptions. And then this is from the work of Kim Dang-yeon and his colleague. So Kim Dang-yeon is one of our lab's member researching on this measurement of inequality. And he compared the tax data and the survey data. So x-axis represents annual income bracket. Y-axis denotes number of people in each income bracket in thousands. So you see, above 200 million Korean won, or 200,000 US dollars, there is no person appearing in the survey data, while tax data captures substantial number of people above 100 million Korean won. So that shows undersampling of high-income households in the survey data. So it's a common problem in everywhere, but it was especially a big problem in Korean surveys of households. And there is also underreporting of high incomes. In particular, financial income is underreported. Only 5% of total financial income was reported by the respondents. So, so the inequality measure based on this survey is problematic. And they revised estimates of Ginies, market income Ginies and disposable income Ginies using tax data. So using both the survey data and the tax data. And then you see 1996 and 2000, 2006 and 2011, market income Gini, disposable income Gini rose substantially. So this is also corroborated with this research on top income shares. So top 1% share of national income, we have very high level of 1% share around the 1930s under the Japanese colonial rule. And then we see it's around 7% of national income during the 1970s and 80s. And then it began to rise and around 12%. And top 10% share, we see this trend now about 43%. And this also shows, especially the top 10% share, which we can see the inequality rose sometime before 1995. And international comparison shows top 1% income shares is much lower than that of the United States, but higher than Japan or France. So this research on top income shares was particularly became pronounced by Piketty's book in what Capital in the 21st century, and the Piketty and their colleagues' approach was used in this study. And then this led to Statistics Korea to abandon the new old household survey and use new household survey data to produce official statistics for income inequality. So, new survey of household finances and the living conditions since 2015 has better sampling of high-income households. So that led to rise in Gini measures. And in addition, they are using administered data to correct some of the survey data. So especially the high-income people tend to underreport their incomes. So this correction made a substantial improvement, but at some limit. I will show the limit later. So this is in line with the international trend of using administered data in measuring inequality, and also in other social sciences. And Denmark, Norway, they are exclusively relying on administered data to produce income inequality measures. And now many countries begin to integrate survey and administered data. And more generally, there is a great emphasis on evidence-based policy making, and increasingly there is an extensive use of full population register data. So Scandinavian countries have been pioneering this. So they've completely replaced the annual census household survey with register data. And also, some of you may know, in the USA, there is also much effort to use administered data in such as American Opportunity Study, and the IRS has recently compiled the panel data set for full American population incomes and taxes. So in Korea, we are a bit late, but we are doing research on inequality using the full population income and wealth database constructed by the National Health Insurance Service. We're just beginning that. And you see, Gini coefficient reported by the Korean government to OECD dumped after the use of new survey data and correction with administered data. And so previously, disposable income Gini was lower than OECD average, but now is higher than the OECD average. So 3.355 is much higher than 0.315. and poverty rate also increased, and so much higher than OECD average and close to the level of United States and Turkey. And elderly poverty is extremely high in Korea.
Jong-sung, can I just ask a clarifying question about that last data? So is that poverty threshold the same? It's comparable across the OECD? This isn't
Yes.
the result of a different threshold in
Yeah.
Because
So
that
it's,
number is such an outlier. That's crazy.
Yeah. So disposable income inequality. So with the criteria of 50% of median household income. So below 50% of median income is in poverty. And the elderly poverty is extremely high in Korea because the public pension system is very shallow and not mature yet. And we now the new survey data is capturing most of the incomes when we compare tax data and other administrative data and the national account. But financial income has been also quite first, the blue line represents survey results for financial income. How much of the financial income has been captured by the survey? And we see it's declining. So high income people do not report very well. And the surveys of financial incomes only 15% of the national total. But it's still substantial improvement from 5% of total financial income captured by the previous household survey. And then we corrected it using administrative data, and you see close to 100% from low-income people to around 200 million won annual income people. Then for the highest income people, it shrinks. So even after the correction with administrative data, 80% of financial income in the highest income bracket is still missing. So it's not underreporting, it's undersampling. So although new survey has made improvement, still the highest income people, it's very difficult to approach them. So they are omitted. And using this survey data and using income capitalization method, so top 10% shares of wealth was also estimated, and Korea's level shows below USA and slightly below China. So China's wealth inequality is growing very rapidly, but higher than France and the UK. So these various measures of top 10% income share, wealth share, and Gini, income Gini, all shows Korea's income inequality and the wealth inequality is now very high, and also the relative poverty is very high. So it's inequality both at the top and the bottom. And another thing, this shows increasing 재벌, family conglomerate in Korea, concentration and the growth without employment. So top 30 재벌's assets now over 100% of GDP, and the Samsung alone over 20% of GDP. And you see after the 1997 financial crisis, it went down for several years, but it increased again. And in 2003, the top 5 재벌 represent 24% of the sales revenue, 27% of the value added, but only less than 9% of employment in manufacturing and mining. So this shows until the early 1990s, manufacturing jobs expanded with full employment, but that's the thing of the past. And in the new service economy, with low productivity and a lot of self-employed, we see increasingly dual labor markets. And lastly, let me briefly introduce new research on distributional national accounts, which is actually pioneered by Piketty, Alvarado, those World Inequality Database team. So some preliminary distributional national accounts for the United States and France have been have come out, and there are Korea. We are now producing very early preliminary results, not to be published yet. So, but the motivation this distributional national account study is we see large disconnect between the study of inequality and the macroeconomy. So macroeconomy, we use national accounts with no distributional information. And traditionally, we use the survey data, and now we use text data. But both the survey and the text data are inconsistent with the macro totals. So the new survey data in Korea uncovers 69% of total assets, 36% of financial assets, and 19% of financial. So this gap makes it hard to know how growth is distributed and to analyze the rise of inequality. So the DINA project attempts to construct a micro database of income, wealth, taxes, and transfers consistent with national account totals using tax data, surveys, and national accounts. And perhaps I have to skip this there. And very preliminary results shows pre-tax national income, post-tax national income, and rate of increase of various income groups. And the one attempt is previously disposable income does not capture social transfers in kind. So disposable income in the income distribution study looked at transfers in cash, but not transfers in kind. So this look at transfers in kind, and we see medical transfers is was quite good, especially more goes to the low-income people, because elderly people are concentrated in the low-income groups. They spend more in medical services, and Korea's almost universal medical insurance gives them in-kind transfers. But education, you see, is regressive. So low-income people get low transfers. So So this is just one of the things we are doing. The last, let me, I have almost 35 minutes passed. So there is an interesting debate on social policy in Korea. So universal basic income is now proposed by Lee Jae-myung, governor of Gyeonggi-do, who is currently leading the polls among the presidential hopefuls for the next presidential election. And Kim Jong-in, leader of the main opposition party, also proposing universal basic income. So there is a possibility of Korea becoming the first country to introduce universal basic income in a few years. And but there is a lot of people who are skeptical about universal basic income and proposing universal employment insurance and the expansion of existing social security system. Famous late Seoul Mayor Park Won-sun, who committed suicide after accusation about sexual harassment, proposed that universal employment insurance is more just than universal base employment insurance. And President Moon Jae-in announced a plan to introduce universal employment insurance, and then he changed the terminology to universal employment safety net. Anyway, that's the key issue in Korea.
Jong-sung, if I could just interrupt, can you just clarify for the audience the difference between universal basic income, which is a little bit like the Andrew Yang proposal, right? And the universal employment insurance, which is different than unemployment insurance. If you could just clarify those concepts so everyone's on the same page.
Okay, so first, the universal employment insurance in Korea is equivalent to universal unemployment insurance in other parts of the world. According to just name it, employment insurance. So it provides unemployment benefits to those who are fired and who has a record of contributing to employment insurance. But the problem with the employment insurance and the national pension, those social insurance are those workers in regular jobs with decent earnings, they are subscribing, they are paying insurance premiums, and when they are fired or when they retire, they get benefits. Most of the workers with non-regular jobs or self-employed are excluded from the social insurance. So the social insurance-based social security system has a dualism. So it reinforces a dualism in the labor market. So universal basic income is an idea to replace or wholly replace or partially replace this dual social security system. On the other hand, there is, let me show this, minimum income guarantee with the social assistance. So typically, minimum income x-axis represents market income, y-axis is disposable income. So the 45-degree line is when you have no taxes, no transfers. The minimum income guarantee in Korea, national minimum livelihood guarantee, is so when your income is below the poverty line. The government supplement the income. So the problem is it creates perverse incentives. When your income is zero, you get this much amount. When your income grows, but below the poverty line, your benefits goes down 100% of your earned income. And in order to get benefit continuously, you have to stay in poverty. So EITC, Earned Income Tax Credit, is a scheme to remove work disincentives among the working poor. But yeah, so traditional social security based on social insurance and the social assistance. Social assistance is criticized by these perverse incentives and poverty trap or unemployment trap, and social insurance system dualized. And this sufficient to UBI, insufficient to UBI, universal basic income, and actually negative income tax can be very similar. The idea is negative income, this can be negative income tax. So you are getting negative income tax. So actually you are getting positive transfer. So EITC is a kind of negative income tax. But in negative income tax scheme, so EITC, there is a zero benefit when your earned income is zero. But in negative income tax, you get certain amount of minimum income guarantee when you have zero earned income. When your income grows, your benefits or negative income declines up to a certain point. After break-even point, then you pay positive income taxes.
Jong-sung, can I ask you to wrap up because we've only got about 20 more minutes because we end sharply at 5.
So negative income tax can be equivalent to universal basic income. So you get universal income and then you are taxed with a flat tax rate, and this becomes actually equivalent. That's the idea of universal basic income. Okay.
Great. Well, thanks very much for that overview, Jong-sung. I mean, you covered an incredible amount of ground. Munsum, I don't know if you want to ask a first question. I have several I want to ask, and we have one in the Q&A as well, which I want to get to. But can I just ask any of you who would like to ask a question, if you just put it in the Q&A, I'm monitoring that, and I will pose the question for you. Munsum?
Okay, so I will ask the first question. So first of all, I have been quite impressed by the serious effort by the researchers and the government, I mean, improving the measurement of the inequality. I think this is a great example of the collaboration between academia and government. And I'm also looking forward to seeing the future results, the future updates from the DINA project. So at the beginning of the presentation, you nicely described the difference between the survey data and the tax data. So the tax data has many advantages, but at the same time, the no data is perfect. So it also has a limitation because it doesn't capture the informal economy, and then it also doesn't capture the financial income coming from the tax havens. And then this missing chunk should depend on across the country. So I wonder how you think about what could be the potential size of this missing chunk in the tax data compared to other developed countries in Korea.
Mm.
Yeah.
Good question. Yeah.
So tax data has its own limits. Yeah, as Professor Lee said. So we see actually among low-income people, their reported income in survey data is higher than the income represented by the tax data. So especially for those self-employed, there is a tendency to underreport their incomes to tax authorities. So, so we think their income is probably more, their report is more honest in the household surveys than to the tax authorities. And there is also a problem of underground economy. So by some estimates, Korea's underground economy represents around 20% of GDP, especially, yeah. so, so actually nobody can know how much is that because it's underground, so estimation. So when we correct the survey data with the tax data and other administrative data on welfare benefits and those things, we use judgment. This item, financial income, we think tax data is better. For some other self-employed income and others, not the case. But we still don't know perfectly. So all these, we have to study more about what kind of incomes are better captured by tax data and what kind of better captured by survey data, and how we can improve survey with this knowledge.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
So Jong-sung, we have a question here, and it goes to one of the most interesting findings from this research, which is just the very high level of poverty among the elderly. And this gets to the question of the pension system. And so Jeff Fattig, who's a former student here, I think he's a former student, or maybe you're still with us, I can't remember now. But he says, politically, the main liberal and conservative parties seem to be fairly similar on the question of public pensions. One of Park Geun-hye's signature accomplishments while she was president was to institute a limited pension system. I don't know if Jeff is referring to the public sector pension or the public pension, because the pension system goes back much earlier than that. But the question is, with the Democratic Party in complete control of the government, why haven't they done more to expand the pension system so that you could get some reduction in this over 65 poverty?
I don't know. I don't know. Actually, so it was Park Geun-hye, the conservative president, who introduced, who actually pledged to introduce universal basic pension for the elderly. But she was unable to keep her pledge. So 70% of elderly are getting universal, not universal, basic pension. So the top 30% of top elderly are not getting basic pension. We have a national pension system, but national pension system is not completely mature, and many people have not contributed to the national pension. So in order to get pension benefit, you should have contributed at least 10 years. And so many don't have that record. And some people have more than 10 years, but with the 10 years and 20 years, the benefits are low. So your contribution history should be at least over 20 years or 30 years in order to get some decent amount of benefits. So that's a problem. So Korea has a good pension system for the public employees, public sector employees, and teachers and professors, and soldiers. But the national pension system, there's a lot of people are not covered. Some people get a very low amount of pension benefits, and the basic pension amount is very low. So it's just around 20,000 Korean won, $2,000 per month. So
let me just clarify one thing. I don't want to spend the whole time on the pension system, but you know, the coverage of Social Security in the United States is fairly broad, but the coverage of the national pension system in Korea is lower, is my understanding, correct? And so then the question is, why is the coverage of the system, set aside the question of maturity, why is the coverage seem to be lower?
you mean coverage of health insurance?
No, of the pension system.
Pension
Of the
system,
national pension system.
So what? Yeah. So coverage of pension system is low. Coverage of health insurance is
high,
quite good in Korea. So it's even in health insurance, there are people who can't pay insurance premium. So, but in health insurance, come to subsidize some low-income people to their health insurance premiums, and a lot of schemes minimize those who are not covered by health insurance. And the lowest income people get social assistance, the health assistance. So it's very coverage is quite good. But also there is this health insurance, universal health insurance system was established during the Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun government, especially during the Kim Dae-jung government. Previously, the health insurance system Korea was there are different cooperatives and the different groups.
Organizations,
yeah, and there was an integration of the whole insurance system that made it. But with regard to pension system and unemployment insurance system, there is no such effort. And also, one of the bigger problem is in health insurance, this pension system and employment insurance, employer and employed contribute half each, and self-employed, you can voluntarily subscribe national insurance or employment insurance, but you have to pay full premium. And Korea's self-employed often with a high discount rate, they just can't think they cannot afford it. So with health insurance, if you are not employees, you are either covered by your family members who are employed, or you can be you can subscribe insurance with the resident status. But in natural pension system and employment insurance system, there's no such a arrangement. So there is a dualism with the
Right.
dual labor market.
Yeah, the two systems are very different. I mean, you know, the healthcare system is an envy of the United States. I wish we had a system like that. But then on the pension side, it's weaker. Listen, Jong-sung, I really want to go back to the inequality data and ask you a causal question. When we think about the causes of rising inequality, there are three main storylines, as you know. You know, one has to do with technological change, and in particular skill bias technological change, which ties into educational differences. And then you have a story around globalization, which, you know, I would think would be very relevant to Korea, about, you know, the effects of trade, foreign direct investment, maybe China as a factor. And then finally, you have a political economy story, which is that unions have been relatively weak in Korea. A low share of the workforce is unionized. I know this is a very big question, but what are the findings with respect to some of the causal factors that are contributing to the rise of inequality in Korea? I mean, it hasn't been dramatic, but these data revisions show it's not insignificant. You're getting up to around 0.4 on some of these Ginies. I think even after transfers. What is the causal story that researchers are finding there?
Actually, your three causal stories are all relevant to Korea.
Yeah, I assume,
Yeah.
right? So it's a question of weighting them, obviously, but.
Yeah. So definitely technology change. So now the skilled person get more compensation, while the middle are squeezed, especially the globalization and the China story. A lot of manufacturing go to China and the other Asian countries. So good manufacturing jobs are disappearing, and they are have to retire early, and they now go to service sector and self-employed, very insecure and low income. So, and then there is a political economic story. Yeah. So table and big companies, especially with exporting industry, they can afford to pay, and they have a high unionization rate. So those workers in the big corporations are organized. So there is implicit alliance with the business, and non-regular, and those are not organized. So Korea's government increased the minimum wage. So Min government's first approach was income-led growth with the increase in minimum wage. That minimum wage increase helped some workers, but those self-employed sector, they are actually adversely affected.
Right,
So
right, yeah,
Moon
very
government had
substantially.
to stop further raising minimum income. Now they have introduced expanding EITC, but it's a still very result of the covering this problem, and especially the elderly poverty. I don't know why the government is so not doing enough.
Right. Let me ask one more question, and this is a question I've been curious about for some time. So there's a spatial story about inequality in the United States, where, you know, this particular area, this is electorally significant. You know, the upper Midwest was hit quite hard with loss of manufacturing employment. It came back to some extent right down the Mississippi River, actually, you know, during the first two and a half years of the Trump administration. Is there a spatial story in Korea about the incidence of manufacturing job loss? Is it concentrated, or is it basically spread fairly equally across the country? Or has there been manufacturing job loss? You mentioned, the idea that jobs have been moving to China, but has there been manufacturing job loss?
Yeah. So in Korea, this spatial story, of course, there are such stories in Korea. So in some cities, there are, when big companies close down, there are big protests from the workers. But probably less salient than in America, because those biggest manufacturing companies, the Hyundai or they go to other countries, but with new factories, the existing factories remain. So, so there are some compromise. So they are protecting the existing ones. But there are stories with some automobile and other. So with the job disappearance, there are protests.
Jong-sung, this was just so interesting. I hope we get more taking advantage of your wisdom. We'll circulate the link. We'll send it to you so that you can also get it out to your colleagues. But thanks so much for joining us. I mean, this really covered a tremendous amount of ground, and it's as Munsub says, it's gratifying to see that this research is going on that's improving the quality of the inequality data. Thanks very much, Jong-sung. So long, everyone. We'll see you next week at the KPP webinar. Bye.